talk about the Star of Bethlehem. So I first, let's just read through the passage, see what kind of biblical evidence there is to begin with. Then I want to talk a bit about the Magi, who they were, and the various theories on them. And then we'll talk about various theories on the Star of Bethlehem. So the actual biblical evidence is fairly scant. It all comes from the first 12 verses of Matthew 2. So I'm going to read through that really quickly. I'm using, if translation-wise, I'm using what's called the Net Bible. I love it because it has like 62,000 footnotes. They had to invent an entire new way of printing the Bible so they could print them all. Basically, the text itself is really small. It's surrounded with a bunch of footnotes. So it's great. I love it. But that's the translation I'm using, partially translated by Dan Wallace, and he was the one who first told me about it. So after Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea, in the time of King Herod, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem saying, "Where is the one who was born King of the Jews? For we saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him." When King Herod heard this, he was alarmed, and all Jerusalem with him. After assembling all the chief priests and experts in the law, he asked them where the Christ was to be born. "In Bethlehem of Judea," they said, "for it is written this way by the prophet, 'And you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judea, are in no way least among the rulers of Judah, for out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel.'" Then Herod privately summoned the wise men and determined from them when the star had appeared. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, "Go and look carefully for the child. When you find him, inform me so that I can go and worship him as well." After listening to the king, they left, and once again the star they saw when it rose led them until it stopped above the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they shouted joyfully. As they came into the house and saw the child with Mary his mother, they bowed down and worshipped him. They opened their treasure boxes and gave him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. After being warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they went back by another route to their own country. So again, that's all we have in the Bible. 12 verses, not a whole lot of data on either the star or the, what's usually translated as wise men. So from that, what can we figure out? So first, like I said, let me talk a little bit about the Magi to begin with. The Greek word there is magus, spelled mu, alpha, gamma, upsilon, iota. I'd write it down, but I don't really have like a board to do that on.
Right on the wall.
But the Greek word there is magus. In Latin, that becomes magi, which is where we get the word. That's also the root word that we get the words mage and magic from. So that gives you some idea of the kind of people we're talking about here. There are various theories as to who the Magi were. The most popular and the one that seems to be the most likely is that they were Zoroastrian priests. Zoroastrianism was a religion that began in Persia, which is present-day Iran. A few centuries BC, I want to say around 500 or so. I'm not sure. I don't remember the exact date offhand. It was a dualistic religion, believing that there was basically a good God and a bad God. It's usually classified as monotheist, but in a lot of ways it really was more dualist. And of course, skeptical scholars will try to claim that a lot of Judaism and Christianity were stolen from Zoroastrianism. But Zoroastrianism was sort of the national religion of Persia until it was conquered by the Muslims. Still has a few adherents. There are a few Zoroastrians still around, not many. But the Magi, or magus, were most likely the priestly caste for Zoroastrianism. Basically, they would have conducted the rituals of the religion. They would have maintained the temples, overseen the religious observances. Big symbols in Zoroastrianism were fire, and also stars and celestial bodies were big. So they would have been studying the stars. They would have been studying them to see what signs that their God had put in the stars. And they would also have been served as advisors to the kings. Most likely they weren't kings. I know there's still sort of a popular tradition of like we three kings and that sort of thing, but almost certainly they were not kings themselves, but they would have been very high up in the court of the king. They would have been advisors. And connected to that, they would have been astrologers. Because again, studying the stars was part of their role as basically priests. And astrology was very tied into astronomy. The two were really one discipline at the time. You didn't really separate astronomy and astrology until around the 1700s. Until then, most people who were doing astronomy were doing it at least in part for astrological reasons. And again, this would have been part of their duties as part of the court of the Parthian kings. The Parthian Empire was the group that was ruling Persia at the time. Because as astrologers, they were discerning the will of God, they were determining the future, they would again have acted as very important advisors to the king. So they would have been watching the stars. That also means that they would have been very, very knowledgeable about the motions of the stars. They didn't really understand why the stars moved. They still had a geocentric idea of the universe where the Earth is at the center and everything moves around it. But they were very, very familiar with how the stars moved. They would have been able to predict the motions of the stars with a fair amount of accuracy. So if they were these Zoroastrian priests, that would have given them a very good reason to be studying the stars. Now, why would they have connected them with any kind of Jewish Messiah? Well, remember that the Jews were in exile in Babylon when Babylon was taken over by the Persians, by Cyrus and Darius. And at that time, Daniel was the chief of the wise men of Babylon, and he went on and sort of carried that position on into the Persian court. So Daniel would have been in a position to at least let the Babylonians and later the Persians know about Jewish prophecies. Also, there was, even at this time, even several centuries after the Babylonian exile, there was still a significant Jewish population in Mesopotamia and in Iran. And in fact, there would be a significant Jewish population there for centuries more. In fact, one of the Talmuds is known as the Babylonian Talmud because of that. So there would have been good reason for the Magi to know the Jewish prophecies, to have some familiarity with them, to maybe be looking out for signs of a Jewish Messiah. So when they saw this sign in the sky, they would have had the background to recognize it for what it was and to associate it with at least potentially Jewish prophecies. So that's sort of the biggest theory as to who the Magi were, these Zoroastrian priests. There are a couple other theories I've come across. One is that the term Magi just sort of became associated with sort of general, quote, wise men, and they could have been serving as part of any religion in any court. One really odd theory I found stated that Magi were actually a tribe of people, a Nabatean tribe that lived, sort of just east of Judea, but that doesn't really fit with what else we see of them. So most likely they would have been scholars. They would have had high positions in the court of the king. They would have been very familiar with the motions of the stars, and they would have been very familiar with astrology, all of which would have led them to be looking for signs in the stars, both as connected to their own religion, but also potentially looking for signs of this Jewish Messiah that they would have known about due to Daniel and other Jewish presence in the area. So that's most likely the nature of the Magi. It's also really important because the Magi would have been from the Parthian Empire, which is what was ruling Persia at the time. Parthia was a rival of Rome. They were, really probably the greatest threat to Roman domination for centuries, which meant that the, Parthian court astrologers showing up inside the Roman Empire and asking about the king of the Jews would have had significant political implications, which, helps to explain, Herod's reaction. I mean, Herod was already psychotically and violently insane. But, knowing the political situation, knowing where they came from, puts a whole extra layer on what was going on there. So those are sort of the main theories about the Magi. Obviously, a lot of traditions have grown up since then. You know, they've been given names, they've been promoted to kings, all this other stuff. But, you know, again, from just the biblical record, all we know is that they were wise men who seemed to come from somewhere east of Judea. Questions so far?
You know, I've never really thought of it. When we read in English language Bibles about the star,
Mm-hmm.
what's the Hebrew term? Do you have any idea?
I don't know. I mean, it wouldn't have been, I mean, obviously the New Testament was written in Greek.
Yeah,
So I
right.
don't know what the Hebrew or the
yeah.
Greek word was.
So, yeah, Greek.
But I mean, I think I do have a note because the Net Bible is really great on that.
It would just mean a bright light.
Yeah, most likely it has more to do with a sign as opposed to just being a single star. They were saying that they'd seen a sign, some kind of sign in the sky.
So that's the implication.
Yes. And, you know, they said they saw it rise in the east. Most likely it's not them saying that we were in the east when we saw it rise. They saw it rise in the eastern part of the sky. So what are some of the theories that we have? We have a few. The first is that it was a purely supernatural occurrence. So this was not in any way natural, that God didn't use previously existing or upcoming natural phenomenon, that this was a purely supernatural sign put in the sky by God for the express purpose of guiding the Magi to Jesus. Now, evidence we have for that, for one, the star is mentioned in some way as moving. Now, popular conception is that the star guided them all the way from their home to Judea. That does not appear to be the case. There's no mention of that. But we are told that the star, after they left Herod, the star reappeared and guided them to the house where Jesus was staying and stopped there. And so that seems to be a very supernatural observance. Several people have also pointed out a potential connection to the pillar of fire and smoke that led the Israelites during the wandering in the desert. Again, you have a situation where you have a supernatural phenomenon leading people to where God wants them to go. So that kind of behavior is very difficult to explain as a purely natural phenomenon. And, you know, and that does fit with the rest of what was going on around the birth of Jesus, that you had visitations of angels, you had, you know, supernatural phenomena, that very little about the birth of Jesus seems to be purely natural. The sort of con there, is that there doesn't seem to be any other records of this, that no one else seems to record seeing a supernatural sign in the sky at that time. Of course, it may be that God was showing it just to the wise men, that it was meant purely for them. It wasn't meant as a general sign. So that is one interpretation. I will say that that is the interpretation I lean towards. I don't really understand the desire people have to want to attach it to a natural phenomenon when everything else about the birth of Jesus seems very supernatural. But nonetheless, people over time have come up with a few different, quote, natural explanations. Again, natural in the way that many miracles are natural and that God is using natural processes, but directing them to happen at a specific time and place. That doesn't remove the supernatural aspect from it. One very popular one, and this was actually proposed first by the Christian astronomer Johannes Kepler, who is like my favorite astronomer ever. He was awesome. And I say that as an astronomer. But he was also a very, very devout Christian and a very orthodox, you know, small o Orthodox Christian, not like, say, someone like Sir Isaac Newton, who was very, you know, heretical, but still called himself a Christian. Kepler was very much, you know, a Orthodox Protestant devout Christian. And he proposed that there would have been a what's called a conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn around 7 to 6 BC. And a conjunction is when two planets come very close together in their orbits, because the planets move through the sky over time in relation to the stars. and each planet follows a very specific path. In fact, being able to plot the motions of the planets was one of the big reasons that people, tried to model how the solar system worked so that they could, predict where the planets were going to go. And so Kepler, based on his calculations, predicted that there would have been a conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn around 7 or 6 BC. Not coming close enough to look like a single star, but coming close enough to create at least a fairly bright light in the sky. Furthermore, astrologically speaking, Jupiter is often seen as symbolizing kingship, and the planet Saturn was often associated with the Jewish people. So at least astrologically speaking, this would have been seen as a sign of a Jewish king. Also, this would have occurred in the constellation Pisces, which was sometimes also seen to represent Israel. Now, at least part of this is more medieval thought. There's medieval cosmology could get very complicated. They ascribed a lot of symbolic interpretations to things. If you're interested, read C.S. Lewis's The Discarded Image. It's a phenomenal introduction to medieval cosmology. And then go read the Space Trilogy because it ties into a lot of that. But this was kind of the first big attempts at explaining the Star of Bethlehem naturally, that it was a conjunction of these two bright planets that had very significant astrological significance. And this fits, having it happen in 6 or 7 BC, fits the calculation of Jesus's birth being before 4 BC. Because I think you talked about, the potential dating of the death of Herod. Did Herod die in 4 BC? Did Herod die in 1 BC? And having the Star of Bethlehem show up around 7 or 6 BC means that that would have given the Magi time to see it, to prep for a journey, and to follow it out. Of course, there are some drawbacks to this theory. One thing is that a conjunction would not have been seen to move and then stop over the house where Jesus was. That's not the way planets work. Also, again, the Magi were very familiar with the motions of the planets, and they would have known that something like this conjunction was coming. It would not have been a surprise to them. But from the text, it at least looks like this was not something that they were looking for. This is something that they saw and realized what it meant. So the fact that that would have been predictable makes it seem a bit less likely. Also, conjunctions are not instant events. They take place over long periods of time. So, you have two planets come close, they get really close, and then they move apart. It's not, just a single event. So I think there are a lot of problems with that theory. Another popular theory is that it was a comet. Comets are basically giant balls of ice and dust that orbit the sun. Occasionally, they get close enough to the sun to become very bright. They create a tail. You've all seen pictures of comets. You might remember back in like 96, we had a couple of really bright comets that you could see with the naked eye. I don't know if any of y'all went out and looked at those. But they basically look like, this comet just hanging in the sky. And Halley's Comet would have come around 12 BC. And there was also another comet recorded by Chinese astronomers around 4 to 5 BC. So people have suggested either of those as being potential candidates for the Star of Bethlehem. Again, especially that one around 4 to 5 BC, that seems to be the right time frame. And at least the Chinese records have it being visible for about 70 days. So that probably would have been enough time for them to make the journey and find Jesus and all that. Mm-hmm.
So, comets go fairly quick, right?
Actually, no, that's a common misconception. People think of comets as sort of zooming through the sky. They don't. That's more like what shooting stars do. Comets look like they're moving fast because they have the tail and everything. But if you actually see them, they look like they're just hanging in the sky, suspended. They don't move fast enough for the naked eye. Now, you go and observe them over multiple nights, you will see them move in the sky. But again, this comet was apparently visible for about 70 days overall.
So the same comet is actually staying within a certain vicinity, visual vicinity.
Yeah.
And
For
for how long, how do you determine the comet would stay longer versus be gone quickly?
Well, that would be determined by how fast the comet's moving in general, but none of them, I mean, any astronomical object is both moving really quickly and from our point of view, moving very slowly. In reality, everything in space moves very quickly, but they're so distant to the naked eye, we usually don't see motion at all.
So put yourself in their shoes.
Yeah,
And you say, every night that I'm out here, because I'm an astrologer and an astronomer, so a lot of their day is.
Yeah.
When I say that is. your
Believe me,
day,
I know.
they all make the day, but at night, they have focus on what's happening up here.
mhm.
And most of the time, they're like, okay, I've seen all this stuff, I know where it is, I know where we're supposed to go. So we have to pick out this occurrence of something.
Yeah.
Whether it's a comet or an asteroid, or I guess you discussed that one. They have to say, this is really out of the ordinary.
Yeah, and comets were completely unpredictable from their point of view. We can predict them a lot better now, but at the time, to them, a comet was something that just appeared without warning, stuck around for a while, and then disappeared. They didn't draw connections. They didn't know that, like, hey, this one comet seems to be showing up every 76 years. To them, it was just a comet. So they didn't have, to them, they were completely unpredictable signs. And comets were almost always interpreted as being very important signs. The thing is that they were almost always predicted as negative. Comets were seen as omens of disaster. In fact, even our own word disaster comes from dis and aster, aster being Latin, Greek, Greek for star, and dis meaning bad. Disaster literally means bad star. And the bad star would have been a comet from their point of view. Comets were seen as portents of disaster. So that's a big mark against this theory, is that they would not have seen a comet and been like, oh, this is wonderful, the new king is born, let's go worship him. They would have seen the comet like, oh no, what's going to happen? So plus, again, comets don't visibly move through the sky, and then they wouldn't have stopped on top of the house where Jesus was. That's going to be a big problem with any kind of natural, explanation. Yeah. Well, no, because they didn't end up in New Jersey, for which they were very glad, I'm sure. Another possible example is that, another possibility is that that's been proposed is that this was a nova or a supernova. And even though their names are similar, novae, and supernovae, that's the plural, are different things. I'm not going to go through a whole lesson here because we're already running late. But basically, these are two different types of exploding stars. And when a star explodes, they become much, 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 much brighter. And a supernova can actually outshine the entire galaxy that it's in for a brief period of time. And so they can look like a new star, because you have a star that was previously too dim to see, suddenly becomes very bright and it's visible. And in fact, the word nova in Latin means new, because it literally means this is a new star. So this has been proposed as an explanation for the star of Bethlehem. In fact, it's popular enough. There is a pretty well-known short story by Arthur C. Clarke, which is one of the great fathers of science fiction, just entitled "The Star," about a group of astronauts who discover a civilization destroyed by a supernova, and it turned out that supernova was the star of Bethlehem. It's an interesting story. So it's a fairly popular explanation. And novae were known. Again, they weren't something that could be predicted. We still can't predict them. We can just see them. So they would have been seen as something sudden, new, and almost definitely some kind of sign. It's possible that it was a nova. Supernova seems unlikely because we can still see what are called supernova remnants. The leftovers of after the star explodes, we can see those hang around for thousands of years, and we don't know of any supernova remnant that comes from roughly that time. So supernova seems unlikely, nova possibly more likely, but there doesn't seem to be any external record of a nova happening around that time. And again, you still can't explain the motion of the star and how it stopped. Now, the one explanation that can potentially explain how it stopped naturally is what's called retrograde motion. And retrograde motion was the sort of bugbear of ancient astronomy, because basically every now and again in its orbit, a planet will do this. In other words, a planet goes along a path for most of the time, but occasionally it will stop, it will turn backwards for a bit, then it will stop and turn back going forwards a bit. That's called retrograde motion. It was the hardest thing for ancient astronomers to explain. And a planet like Jupiter or Saturn going through retrograde motion could appear to at least temporarily stop in place and then move backward for a bit before it started to go forward. So that could be an explanation for how a star could stop. Maybe it was something like Jupiter going through retrograde motion. But again, even though they couldn't explain it, they knew what retrograde motion was. It happened all the time. It would not have been seen as something especially special. So that sort of thing could explain why a star, or what they would call a star, we would call a planet, might appear to stop in its motion, but it wouldn't have been seen as special. So these are all the quote natural explanations. Again, I think they all fall short, which is why I really think that the Star of Bethlehem was a supernatural sign. It fits with everything else. It fits with everything else supernatural happening around the birth of Jesus. It fits with the fact that only the Magi seem to have seen this sign. It wasn't widely noted, so it seems to have been put there especially for them. And it fits, the behavior, how they see it. And as far as we can tell, it disappears for a while because they don't mention following it. But then when they leave Herod, suddenly it pops up again and shows them right where to go. So that certainly seems to be a, divine phenomenon, not a natural occurrence. So again, those are some of the most popular theories. Any final questions? George.
Eric, do you see the Star of Bethlehem as analogous perhaps to the light that Paul saw on the Damascus Road in Acts chapter 9? It appears in the text that the people with him heard the voice, but didn't see the light.
Yeah.
But he saw a light.
Yeah, there's certainly people who have tied it in with things like the Shekinah glory and that sort of, sort of divine light. And again, it's something that would have been targeted specifically toward the Magi. Yeah, which, yeah.
In Revelation 12, where it talks about the birth of Christ and the dragon waiting.
Assuming that's what it's talking about.
Talks about the stars in heaven and a third of the stars being swept away by the dragon's tail. Has anybody proposed that the star might have been an angel?
Oh, I'm sure someone has. I didn't come across that. And I make it a rule never to comment on Revelation, because my interpretation is not a particularly popular interpretation, and because it is just not worth it. You're going to be wrong, it seems like.
So if I were one of those three bad guys, I'm usually looking at all these stars, and then this happens with Jesus being born, and they haven't connected dots to get them to this point. Then they know they got to go back a separate way to get back wherever they came from. When you think that they would be scribbling or writing or just hysterically trying to get all this down to be able to
that's possible, but that's the thing is that,
something coming from different cultures, wherever they came from, they would say, this occurrence happened. We can't tell you where it happened, but we want to let you know that this is.
It's possible they wrote something. I think like over 90% of all ancient writings are lost. I mean, even like Rome, we have a small fraction of everything that was written down. There's very important books that we don't have. So it's possible they wrote something and it just hasn't survived.
Two things. First of all, coincidentally, yesterday I had a conversation with somebody from Persia, in all places, the place that I worked out, and we were discussing Zoroastrianism. And he was very familiar with it. So he's first generation here. So it may be that anybody who was of that particular understanding has left the country. I'm not really sure.
Yeah, well, there aren't many left.
Can't believe
I
there
think
were
there,
many.
I think there, the last I heard, there are like a few 100,000. You do find communities of them outside. There are groups called the Parsi, I think, who are like in India and Pakistan. They're Zoroastrians. The best known Parsis, Freddie Mercury was Zoroastrian.
So the second question I have is that, we'll say that Jesus is born in year zero. Or,
Well, there was no year zero.
well, right, that's why I'm using it kind of like, there's this -9 months beforehand, and then there's up to 2 years thereafter, where this star could have possibly occurred, and then continued to occur.
Yeah.
To provide direction. So how would somebody from Zoroastrianism actually understand this? Because it's not a Judea understanding, it's clearly something from Zoroastrianism.
Yeah, but well, again, they did have some knowledge of Jewish scriptures and Jewish prophecies to connect it to. I mean, I'm sure they could have seen it as a sign from their god, Ahura Mazda. Exactly how they would have interpreted it otherwise, is they don't come in saying, we're coming to look, for, the birth of Yahweh or something. They just come in saying, we're looking for the King of the Jews.
Well, they would have known a lot about the Bible through Daniel.
Yeah, potentially. I mean, we don't know that for certain, but certainly potentially through Daniel. And again, there was still at that point a large Jewish population in that area.
Daniel, Ezekiel, all
Mhm.
of them are there, so, and we don't have those writings actually transmitted, we can't see that. So I'm just trying to figure out what it is that was so unique to them that made this star important. And I'm actually following up on a conversation I had yesterday.
Well, and this is another reason I really think it was supernatural and that it was just for them. It wasn't something that was seen by everyone. And it was probably, I mean, there are various theological interpretations, but it does bring in the idea of, Jesus being for the world, to bring in these people, these Gentiles from outside. Dan?
Did they know that it was the star signified the king of the Jews because it was a 6-pointed star?
Probably not.
Hey, we've got 1.5 minutes left. Did you want to comment on Herod and the slaughter of the innocents?
I didn't really have anything prepared about it. Anything particular you want me to say about it? Herod was a bad, bad man.
Very bad. Well, I wrote so that people online. Without going into any details, why is this account not included in ancient historical?
Because it wasn't a big deal. It was
Mhm.
Bethlehem was a small town. It was a few babies and no one cared.
Mhm.
The Romans certainly didn't care.
Yeah, I talked about how that at most the population of Bethlehem might have been 1,000, could have been just a few hundred. And if that were the case, then the number of
Male children.
male
below the age of
boys, under the age of 2 could have been like 15 or 20. Now, when you look at Herod, a megalomaniacal despot, as I wrote, and a man of violence, he perpetrated so many atrocities. I mean, this is somebody who ordered the execution of his wife, one of his
sons.
one of his brothers, 3 of his sons, and many, many other people as well, of course. So I concluded that in actuality, the slaughter of the innocents might have been a relatively minor incident in Herod's reign of terror. That's why Josephus doesn't mention it. That's a plausible explanation. So Herod might have killed perhaps 20 baby boys. Therefore, the murders constituted a relatively minor atrocity, at least by Herodian standards, and could well have escaped the attention of Josephus. Yeah, there are much more important things to talk about. in the mind of Josephus, yeah. So we remember Herod is one of the greatest builders in all of ancient history. Those of you who've been to Israel, have seen, it's unbelievable. The ruins of some of his building projects and so on. So that's what he's primarily remembered for. And so any other thing for Eric real quickly before we close things out? Well, thank you very much. Yeah.